Welcome, everybody, to episode 4 of Masks and Mimicry, the show where we talk about tabletop role-playing games and specifically try to focus a little bit on roleplay itself. In this particular episode, we're going to talk about Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition, part 2 of our 3-part series on creating role-playing characters specifically for that game. This time we're going to be talking about values and vulnerabilities, about the different values, goals, and weaknesses that you can build into your characters and how you can have fun with it. With me, as always, is Brand.
Hello, everyone.
Welcome to the show. So, we just want to dive right into this. We have a fair few different people with us today, more than we usually have, which is awesome. So I just want to throw out there for everybody, we'll talk about a number of different topics. We mostly try to stay focused, but we may wander around a little bit. I usually like to ask a number of different questions, and I'll ask them of Brand, but really I'm always asking them of everybody. So if you feel like railing off in chat, throwing out anything, or asking us questions, feel free. We do watch respond. Chat. We will try to pick out things and respond and add them to the conversation. I just noticed for some reason the chat box, it is now functioning. For some reason it's been blank.
All good.
Making me anxious. Anyway, let's get into this. So I decided to start this off. I actually wanted to start off talking about goals instead of starting off about values. I was putting a lot of thought into this earlier, thinking about exactly how they play off of each other. And so I wanted to start off with that. How do you, again, both for Brand and for everybody else, how do you decide on goals for your characters?
I think goals, for me, tend to come secondary to figuring out what my conflict story is, if there is one, and usually the goals coincide with experiencing the resolution of that conflict that the DM then provides. We talked, I think, the last episode about vagueness as an element of adding interesting story elements to your character, and that vagueness coming from the DM filling in what I've given to him or her. My goals kind of start to coincide with experiencing that story.
Okay. Yeah, I think for me, goals come from the character concept. I was trying to think about this and decide. I actually had to really put some thought into it earlier because I was thinking about this and mulling it around. I was like, where do I create goals when I'm creating a character? Do I create them when I'm working on the backstory? But I feel like it comes in a few stages. First, I usually start with a character concept. I think about what character I want to play in a very broad strokes sort of fashion. And we talked about this in the last episode about creating our characters and creating our backstories and everything. I think, what do I want to play? And then I create that archetype, that image in my mind of what I want to play. And with that kind of comes what I want to be doing with that character a little bit. And so I kind of, as I have the concept, I then go into different goals that the character might have or different things I want them to be doing. Then I start working on that backstory. I start introducing elements of the background and the conflicts and such that exist with a character. And that then helps to shape those goals a little bit more, help to refine them down. And I go, okay, well, I was thinking of something along these lines, and now I can channel it into something much more specific.
Totally the reverse of me, but both perfectly plausible ways to go about it.
Well, and I think goals are important. Plague State which I think is Malice, is saying he doesn't do goals. Does personality and then see what the DM has in mind for the game, and then work on some goals based on the campaign, which is viable. Because I was going to say I think goals are important to have in large part for a couple different reasons. I think it helps to shape the type of character you want to play, but also it comes based on a very important question: what drives them to adventure?
Right.
You need goals to do stuff with the group. If your character doesn't have goals, whether you set them up beforehand or you set them up once you see what the game's going to be like, and I definitely think that coming out of like a session zero, things that come out of a session zero and conversations with the dungeon master or the other players can certainly help feed in developing your goals. But having those is important to giving your character motivation for doing anything with the party. Oh, hi, Dustin.
Yes. Um, Totally true. And character can have multiple goals, not just one. They might have one or two big ones that follow their backstory, and then several smaller ones, just simple, unique things that they might want to experience along the way that are kind of superfluous, uh, meaningless in the long scope of the campaign, but meaningful to the character's progression.
Okay. Yeah. Let's see. Dustin's saying take simple concepts, one's done a lot, and then ask how they can do it differently. I don't think of it in those terms, but often, I mean, there's only so many goals you can have. Even if you get pretty specific, they fall into broader categories of things that, because there's only so many of them, have certainly been done before. Is it a quest for power? Is it a quest for knowledge? Is it, it falls into some of these different categories, regardless of how you're doing it. So I don't normally think of it in those terms, except I do very much when I create a goal, I then do kind of if I start thinking about that, like, oh, this gets done a lot, so how is it specific for this character? So in a way, it's kind of a similar approach, though I guess for me it's more reactive. Um,
Yeah.
Upon realizing, like, oh, this has been done a lot, how do I vary it up some, um, shape this a little bit? And I was trying to think of an example from some of my current characters and recent characters, for how this has worked out. And for my current wizard that I've
Hmm.
referenced pretty regularly, Rowan, uh, the I started with him with a very basic concept. I was like, I want to play a wizard who has something of a dark past, is a bit of a perhaps a shady character, and is running from something. That's his motivation. He has a couple different motivations, and I should say I think you should have more than one goal for sure. You shouldn't
Absolutely.
just have a goal, but have a couple overarching goals. And I was like, no, he's running from something, and he seeks knowledge and power. Pursuit of those almost as a sort of pursuit for safety. Um,
Hmm.
and so I start with that. I started with the concept, and then that morphed into those are the overarching goals. Then I started working on his backstory and introduced specific reasons, like, okay, that's what he's running from.
Right.
And that's how it kind of, I guess, gets into something more specific. Like, okay, this is how it's different than just the broad archetype.
Yeah, I can see that. And there, you definitely, at least with that character, have a number of even smaller goals that are just more influenced by personality rather than
Mm-hmm.
situation, which is nice to have just those different things. Some of them are goals that can't necessarily be failed, which is fine because you just get to experience your goal taking shape. I like to put in goals sometimes that could go either way, because failing your goal can certainly also influence new goals to come about from that in the process of experiencing it.
For sure. Now, I did want to transition into values since that is one of the main focus of this episode, and start that with a slightly different topic. Though I'm going to kind of come back to goals a little bit, and that
Sure.
is, do you ever, or I guess how much do you think about what your character's values are?
Uh, I don't do it every session. I probably should. Um, I will circle around to it every few sessions, especially when something big happens to my character. Like in your campaign on Mondays, my character nearly died
Mm-hmm.
very early on. And that begged the question of, okay, does something change with this? Does he now value something that he didn't value before, like his life, maybe,
Mm-hmm.
or safety or caution? as he is an individual who doesn't really take caution with things? Does he now suddenly have a more value for it? And that kind of element. So I'll come around to every so often just to kind of revisualize and re-look at my character and what's happened and where it can go from there.
That makes me feel a little bit better because I was thinking about this earlier as well as when I was kind of jotting down what my questions for this were going to be. And I realized that I don't think I think about values enough. Or at least, I don't think I think about my character's values enough when creating them. Like it's a bit of an afterthought.
Mm-hmm.
Not entirely, but like I go and I have kind of a process. I think of a character concept of what I want to play and what I want them to be doing, and then I kind of almost look at that and say and start to you let that inform what the character's values are. And but I don't have like a moment where I don't have like a procedure where I'm like, all right, step 4, what are the character's values? As much as just I'm creating all this stuff and then I start that kind of starts to feed back and I'm like, oh, well, I guess that means this is what the character values. And then eventually it comes up, but I don't have it like built in, as like, oh yes,
Yeah.
remember, think about values.
And actually with D&D, it kind of ties in with their bonds and that category of things you choose. Like you roll a d6 to choose like a bond or something when you're creating your background
Mm-hmm.
from the list of backgrounds, and it kind of ties into that. And so you kind of
Yeah,
start
it
to
can.
not think a little bit about like the specific values because it's sort of grouped up into this list that we all kind of pick and choose from.
Yeah, and I definitely think that 5e has done added some good things, like we mentioned last episode, with backgrounds and stuff that do make you think about some of these things and make other people think about them a little bit more than they would before. Um, but I very much agree with Plague State that values develop. Um, I do think that you can start with certain values in your character, and a lot of different things about your character develop as you play them, and they do shift a little bit until you're comfortable. I don't feel like they change so much as it is. It's kind of like a house settling. You build it, and then over time it settles. It kind of sinks into position and becomes firm.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a little loosey goosey at the beginning until you start playing the character, interacting with other people, and then things tighten up,
Yeah,
become
I
more
mean, a lot of
resolute.
people have core values, things that have
Mm-hmm.
literally built their personality through their years of aging that they will never change, or at least be very difficult to change. They may start to question it a little bit, but it's not usually an instant change. And then there are
Mm-hmm.
some that are just light switch. The value changes based off of a moment that happened that they're suddenly, oh well, that
They
makes more
almost
sense than
die.
what I was thinking. Yeah.
um, and I will say, like, for sure, like, after a character is created and I start playing them, I start thinking about values much more at that point.
Hmm.
Um, like I've thought about them before and kind of went, well, like this is what their values are. But then through play, they're either reaffirmed or adjusted a bit. Now we started talking about this particular topic a little bit when I appeared Monday on the Tabletop to Keyboard Wisdom Check podcast. And I wanted to bring it up here as well, specifically in this context. How are values different than alignment, or are they not?
um, Values, and let's see if I can say this properly. Are things that your character believes in, things your character stands by, that inform decisions and the decision making process of a character. Those decisions then inform alignment. So I kind of look at it as a two-step process. They're not the same things, but one does inform the other.
I would actually say for me, I think that it's a little bit of a reciprocal relationship. I think there's a bit of a cycle there, at least in terms of how I see it, and and a part of this is based on how I interpret alignment. And we have it in our plans to eventually have an episode just discussing alignment. But how I view alignment is very much as a system of values. If you are chaotic, then you do not value order and law. If you are lawful, then you do value order and law, and you see no value in the elements of chaos and spontaneity, or little value anyway. If you're good, you value other people and their well-being. If you are evil, you value your good and your well-being over theirs, and that's generally, I see those as value statements. Um, but I don't necessarily think that your alignment dictates your values as much as I think they kind of feed off each other. Like you said, to some degree,
One
you
can
you create
inform
your
the other.
values, and then that kind of determines your alignment. But similarly, like you can go, well, I'm thinking about someone who's more chaotic, and then that also might help to develop your values.
Yeah,
Um,
as far as the development process goes,
mhm.
for sure. uh you were saying if you're good then you do this. As far as like in the moment goes, being the character, I view it the reverse. If you do this, then you are good, rather than following an alignment and letting that dictate what I should be doing, versus just being the character and doing stuff and then watching the alignment needle kind of fluctuate a little bit.
Well, that's what I said. I think they're reciprocal.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a bit of a cycle. Your values in action kind of dictate
Hmm.
what your alignment actually is.
Yeah.
But I see alignment as a mechanic more than anything else. It is a mechanical system that is put in place to make you think about these things and make you kind
Hmm.
of pick one and decide how you wanna do it. Um, and I agree, Plague. Like that's kind of why I mentioned that. Um, this is how I view alignment, because people view
Yeah.
alignment differently, and interpret it differently, and see it in different ways. And I see it as, especially in part because I don't like systems where alignment is dictated in a hard, linear, delineated fashion. This is good. This is evil. Goblins and orcs are bad. I don't really like that. I much prefer for there to be shades of gray, and so I like to see, even when I say that, like, to be good aligned means that you are more selfless. You are more into the good of other people. That doesn't mean you can't do anything that's selfish.
Sure.
There's shades of gray. You can still be a good person and occasionally do something selfish. That's fine.
Absolutely. People do it every day.
Yeah, for sure. Um, and I was trying to think of how, and again, this is in terms, in the context of creating characters, is
Yes.
why we're discussing this, and so why I think there's a reciprocal relationship in that part. Because again, to use my character Rowan as an example, because he's a recent example, uh,
Hmm.
in my character concept for him, I didn't really pick an alignment, but I was like, I want someone who kind of defies the norms of wizards a little bit. And so instead of being like, wizards are usually seen as very studious and lawful and orderly. And while he is some of those things, I see him as being a little bit more shady, a little bit more chaotic. And so then when I started looking at alignment and everything, I started playing with the idea of a chaotic wizard, but not someone who's like a wild magic wizard or anything, but someone who just behaviorally is more chaotic. And
Yeah.
then upon selecting that, I then go, what does that do to his values? What does it mean he values if he is chaotic? If he is not kind of regimented into doing that? Because it implies, at least for me, that means he doesn't really value law and order nearly as much. And that also
I've
feeds in the
noticed.
backstory. Then I go back to the background and I start creating the background. I'm like, why doesn't he value law and order that much? Well, because of this and this and this.
Yeah.
And then that helps to shape all the values and everything. Go, okay, well, because of these things, it doesn't really value that. It doesn't value that. He's like, oh, you stole this thing? I don't care. That's fine. And
Yeah.
everyone's like, wait, you don't care that I stole this? Nope, not a single bit. Just don't get caught.
And
Don't get me into trouble. Then we'll have
right.
problems.
It all kind of circles around and comes back to itself at some point. You start somewhere, it informs a different thing, and
Hmm.
part of the creation process that informs a different thing, and then it kind of comes back and informs a new thing, and you kind of go through the cycle of adjusting and fixing
Yeah.
and just figuring it out.
And I'm not sure that process ever stops. Um,
No.
as Plague said earlier, when you're playing, new values are tested. Values are
Yeah.
tested and new values emerge. And there's character development. Your characters change, they grow over time, and their values may shift. Their goals may shift. They may go into the game thinking, I'm going to become filthy rich. And then by the end of the game, if it's a longer campaign, that's no longer a priority. They don't care
Yeah.
about that. You could look at the Han Solo type scoundrel character for a model of that.
Hmm.
Someone who goes into it caring nothing, only about money, doesn't care about anybody or anything, and then by the end, I mean, yeah, his money's still nice, but it's not the fixation of the character anymore.
Right. There was some push and motivation to do the right thing.
Let's see, Grimslag played a paladin of balance. His character alignment changed to counter the nature of the environment he was moving within.
Hmm. That's cool.
I could see that being interesting.
Yeah.
Trying to maintain the overall balance by countering, I guess, what is too prevalent in around them. Could be interesting. Now, I like to do a lot of polls. I did have a pre-poll sort of posted, and anyone who wants to ever take part in my pre-polls I put up before the show, I post them on my Twitter account, which is @Xenoduck. It's an XENO duck. But I didn't get any responses to this one, so I'm not going to post it up. So instead, I'm just going to kind of ask the question.
Sure.
How do you identify your character's values? Is it just off what we've talked about already with just looking at, like you said, with your goals, or is it a little bit different than the goals?
Typically it comes after background, or it's kind of in the process of figuring out personality with me and things he likes, things he doesn't. For my character in your campaign, who is, now that everyone in the party is aware of it, I can say it, is a changeling. It was actually very difficult, and I actually put a lot more time into identifying them because he is a changeling, and I had to start asking the question, when he changes, do the values change? What are his values if they do change for each of these personalities? And really start figuring out the way he's going to act, and then figuring out values based off of that. Things that might kind of follow that line of thinking, or his actions in those personality or changes. As well as being a paladin, there's a divine element that he has to start balancing a value in how he goes about worshiping or handling his divine influence.
Yeah, I think for me, identifying my character's values comes after the goals. I think it's a product. It's a continual product, and I think it works for me. And I've said this before, and I'll reiterate it again. Everyone has their own process. Everyone has their own method for creating characters. But I think for me, I start, like I've said before, I start with the concept, the character concept, and then I start to build that out into goals, and then I create the backstory, and that helps to shape the goals further. And then I look at primarily those two things, I think. I look at the character concept, and then I look at my character's goals. And then I start to identify their values. And then I also look at what I've created for their backstory and what they've done in there. And I look at that and I go to really start thinking about, okay, what are their goals? To try to start defining them at that point. Or not their goals, sorry. What are their values? To start defining them at that point. Because I look at it and say, okay, this is what I want to do. The character concept. That's what I want to do. That's what I want to play. And that may have adjusted a little bit as I was writing all this. But then what are their goals? Because their goals are going to be based on their values. And I don't necessarily, and so they kind of reveal the values for me. I look at that and I'm going, okay, this character is running from something. They're running from something, and they're seeking power and knowledge. So they clearly value knowledge as a path to being stronger and being more protected. They clearly value their own life because they're trying to get away from all of this. But then, like, for instance, there is and I don't want to get too much detail on the end of this because there may be people who actually play our game that are watching this. Um, who a lot of this information about this character has come out before, but not necessarily all of it. And if I was looking at his backstory, has he lived these values? And
Hmm.
how much has he lived these values? And there is at least one thing in there where like I tried to like I said, I wanted to make a wizard that was kind of more chaotic, but then on the other hand I was like, but he's still a good person. Like he's chaotic, but he's not bad or even neutral. He still tries to be a good person. And he has certain values such as protecting other people, especially friends or people that he thinks are less fortunate than others. And then I look at the backstory and I'm like, but he hasn't always lived that value. He hasn't always stood up to that principle. Does that mean that he doesn't have that value? I don't think it does. Plague mentioned earlier that values develop, and values aren't really values unless they're tested. But I think you can still have values that you might have failed with.
Totally.
And like in his case, it's like, does he not value that? I think he does still value it, but it is perhaps a source of shame because there are perhaps times in his past where he has failed to live up to that value. And so it's still a value because he tries to do better and tries to get more strength so that he
Sure.
can better fulfill that later on.
Yeah. Thinking about your campaign and how we started it, actually was also interesting as far as my character goes for that. And I not only had to think of my changeling values, I had to think about, well, there was a life before we all went to prison. So there's probably values from that.
Mm-hmm.
And now start to think about how those values either got warped, if they did, and what new values, if any, came about from being in prison, as that was the start of our campaign, and still technically part of the backstory. But there was that shift in just completely different style of life, and you kind of have now two new sets of values to work with.
And our thesis puts character value at about 50 gold per day, which I think is a generous estimate. I don't know. That could be pretty accurate. One thing that I think is really important to discuss and that I wanted to pose for everyone, again in chat and for you as well, is how do you demonstrate your character's values in roleplay?
Uh, Probably, hopefully they come up naturally, as everyone has different values, and sometimes those values are a conflict with other players' values, and you start to butt heads against each other. You might want to do one thing, another player might want to do something else, and those values kind of come up into play
Mm-hmm.
as you're both competing against performing them or following them.
Yeah, I think I wanted to discuss this question, but on the other hand, I do think it's important to point out that people don't necessarily have to know what your character's values are
Nope.
because that can kind of reveal a lot about your character. And I think that you most show your character's values through your actions, of course, which seems
Hmm.
like a kind of a cop out answer, but I think that's
But
the
it's the
ultimate
true answer.
truth. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
whatever your character is doing, is whatever the choices they're making that reveals their values more than anything else. But also their reactions to other people's choices or plans. And I think that's an important thing to consider because, a lot of times, especially for either uh, less experienced role players or for people who are perhaps more shy, they don't necessarily want to have their character react negatively to something that somebody else does, for instance. But that can be a very, as Plague mentioned earlier, a very prominent way of testing your values.
Yeah. To challenge
To
them.
have the character stand up to someone else in the party. It's kind of like standing up to your friend if they're doing something wrong. If your character does not agree with something that the party is doing or other people, then your character by all means should say so, should stand up for that. And I think that more than anything can actually reveal your character's true, like strongest values if you're willing to
Yeah,
actually stand up to the other party members on something.
you can Neville Longbottom that.
Yeah, and Narthesis is absolutely correct. Characters' values may certainly evolve through the campaign. Um, there's going to be different things that you do, different things that happen to your character that's going to change and affect what is most important to your character. And they should change. If your character's values at the end of a long campaign, it's important to say that, a long campaign,
Yeah.
are the exact same as their values at the beginning of the campaign, then it's like, have they lived any? I mean, have they done
No.
anything?
And I'm sure a lot of people go through that and they'll just play the game and not really think. I guess that means they're showing that they're not really thinking about the things that have happened to them, and allowing the change or asking the question, what has changed because of this thing?
Yeah.
And they're
Now,
just kind of going with it.
I could totally see it being viable. That, in some games, your values may not shift very much. Your character may hold true. But I do feel like in most games, there's going to be things that come up that make you at least question them and at least think about them if you are thinking about them. And I do think that's maybe where, from the conversation we've had so far and the comments we've had so far, that is perhaps where the true reflection on values comes into play. You think about it during character creation, but you continue to reflect upon it while playing and going through the life of the character. In drama, a character who changes is a tragedy character. If not, it's a comedy. That's often pretty true. If your character sticks to what they're doing, no matter what, then it is going to get pretty comedic, pretty fast, most likely. So, was there anything else you want to talk about values? Because I kind of want to start switching into vulnerabilities.
I had one. I lost it somewhere in the back of my head. So if I remember it at some point, I'll bring it back up later.
All right. Fair enough. So then let's talk weaknesses.
Yes.
Vulnerabilities. I want to start with mechanical weaknesses because I know that you have a fondness of building in mechanical weakness in your characters. So I wanted to start there by giving you a chance to explain why.
It's fun. It's fun to fail in a roleplay setting like this for D&D. There's a lot of laughs involved usually, especially for my current and previous character who were built around failing at very specific things. But it gives a sense of exactly. It just gives a sense of a better character to me. So I force it if I need to, which I did in the case of my most current character. I rolled really well for my stats and decided to just ignore one of them and just give me a negative, because it starts building a character and answers some questions and creates new questions to figuring out personality.
Yeah, I could say for my take on mechanical weaknesses, I'm not like an overall huge fan of building things in mechanically. I do think it's good to have a character who isn't all powerful. You don't want a character who has nothing but super awesome positive stats. It's good to have at least like some average scores and such. I don't ever feel inclined to necessarily feel like a character has to have a negative, because I don't necessarily think that that's entirely realistic. I definitely think having like an 11 or 12 in something is viable, but we usually roll stats, so usually you're going to have a negative in something regardless. But like even if I don't get one, I would probably do something if I had like all 16s. I'd be like, that's not realistic. But as long as some of the scores are fairly low, I think that's okay, at least for me. But I do think it makes a more realistic character, someone that you can identify a little bit more with a little bit more if they have some weaknesses, whether those are mechanical
Yeah.
or otherwise. Um, and so, while I don't think mechanical weaknesses are usually necessary, because I think you can avoid doing certain things in RP, or you can just kind of role play yourself failing at them because you want to. Like I often make my character Rohan fail at lying, with or without a roll, because I've said canon he's not good at it.
Yeah.
Um, uh, but I do think it's easier when you suck at them mechanically. I do think it's easier and kind of reinforced a little bit more. So while I don't think it's
Right.
necessarily going to be necessary, I do think it's reinforced and encouraged by having that mechanical system in there sometimes. And it also allows you to tie it to randomness, which can be fun.
Yep.
Instead of just you deciding like, oh, I'm going to run and jump on this table, but because I'm awful at acrobatics, I trip and fall. And you're like, I'm gonna do it, and then you roll, and oh look, as everyone expected, I failed.
Yeah. Like in my case, I chose the weakness, I chose the negative stat, and went about it in a way rather than being like, "Oh, you suck at this." Try to through my backstory and through just my concept of creating the character, explain or why he just doesn't do good at it. Not that he's bad at it, he just doesn't do it. It's harder for him to really get into that mindset of doing the thing. So we're talking about wisdom in this case.
Mm-hmm.
I will almost never roll a perception check at this point with that character out of principle, just because I've explained why he wouldn't even be paying attention.
Mm-hmm. And Plague makes a good point that having it built in mechanically helps to keep you honest.
Yeah.
Um, which I can say I have seen some value in on occasion for certain things. I've seen some value in it. Like for instance, I mentioned this before. In your current game, you decided that for certain types of skill and tool checks, if you're not proficient, you'll actually have disadvantage with it, because it just makes it that much harder for you to do well at. And my character has on occasion made lockpicking checks because he has
Mm-hmm.
thieves tools. And I like he will attempt occasionally, because it actually kind of is a part of his story that he's not proficient in lockpicking, but he's also not completely ignorant of how to do it. Like he does have thieves tools for a reason.
Right.
He's kind of familiar with it, but he's not really good at it. And so having the possibility, so he will try it. And so it actually works well for that because he's not really good at it. But whereas normally I would just either avoid doing something that he's not good at, or I would just say that he fails, or I would do it in such a way like that, like I'm like, I totally didn't steal that thing. No, I wouldn't do that. It's just like you did,
Yeah.
because I'm bad at lying. But it doesn't really work well when it's like, oh, he would want to try to do this, but he's bad, but he's not good at it. And that's
Right.
the case. Like he's not good at it, so he usually doesn't try to pick locks. But if like everyone else has tried, or in certain emergency situations, he's like, oh God, I'm gonna pick the lock, and he
Mm-hmm.
tries, and then on a rare occasion succeeds, and then it feels really cool because he's like, I did it. I told you I knew how to do it. When he's tried 20 other times and failed,
Yeah.
at that point, it's kind of nice to have. It works out well for that particular character anyway.
Absolutely.
Um, and that's why I think it's important when you're doing stuff like that it's kind of, at least to some extent, it's the player's choice. Like you have mechanical penalties, but you apply those to your character. You go like,
Mm-hmm.
hey, can I do this? Can I give myself a voluntary 8 in this? And I'm like, well, I'm not going to tell you can't make your character weaker, so sure, go for it.
Yeah.
But it's your choice to do it. And even before implementing like that rule, you asked all the players, like, are you okay with me doing this?
Yeah, you guys got to choose, do you want this or not? And in that case, you guys all said yeah.
Yeah,
So
sounds like
uh
worth a shot.
and there are other forms of mechanical weaknesses that you can see in different elements of D&D. For anyone who watches like Critical Role, one of the players there or the characters has a very mechanical weakness in regards to certain actions that take place with him using certain spells on certain types of people
Mm,
that require a roll after that action takes place that could influence the moment. And it's, I think, important to not dive too deep into those types of things. You can do some of them, and they could be very informative for your character, but
hmm
you want to be careful about doing something that could really hinder your moment with, like, in combat, especially, or just in general, not something that can really affect your enjoyment of continuing to play.
Yeah. And Plague brings up a good point that some games, pay you to have flaws. They
Hmm.
give you rewards for taking mechanical flaws. And while D&D Fifth Ed doesn't, we do have there. I think second edition did actually, if I remember correctly. It's been a long time, but I think second edition actually, you could take some flaws and get some points for it. But we do eventually plan on doing a series similar to this, specifically on Vampire the Masquerade and
Yeah,
creating characters for that, and we would definitely get into that a bit. Um, so let's talk about the flaws themselves a little bit.
sure.
Starting with, what are your favorite types of flaws to have on a character? For me, it's social flaws. I think more than anything else, especially things that accentuate or run counter to their goals, like things that make the goals more challenging or alter the way that I have to pursue them in some way.
Hmm.
For instance, if I have a character with like a social goal, they want influence over an area, but then they're very disliked in that area. They have a bad reputation or something that they have to struggle against. Or perhaps they're really bad at persuading people.
Absolutely. I like flaws that they could be classified as social, and they may be more generic, that come up through just playing D&D, that might be the result of dice rolls. They're just kind of built into these elements, whether they're social or not. Um, and then I start to look at them as how they work with the concept I have. Will they come up frequently enough to be seen? I definitely want my flaws to be noticed, I guess, is kind of more what I'm saying, regardless what they are. And that is more important to me than the type of flaw necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, flaws should definitely be noticed because if they're not penalizing you in some fashion, then it's not really a flaw.
Yeah.
And this is especially true for certain other games like World of Darkness and stuff, where they're generally very much mechanical flaws.
Hmm.
But I think in D&D they are as well. If you give your character a flaw, but it's not represented in play very often or at all, then it's not really a flaw. Like if you give your character, it's like the dump stat. Oh, I have a barbarian who
Right.
is super strong but has a very low charisma, and I just let everyone else do the talking all the time. Then that's not really a flaw. Your character doesn't suffer from it, and you don't really use it or bring it up. That's why sometimes, like when I have things that my characters are weak at, I still like it to come up sometimes as a thing like I
Hmm.
might do. Like you're like, make a perception check. I'm like, oh, my wizard is so bad at perception checks. Okay, let's go for it. Other things come up through role play.
Yeah.
For instance, my character does have very high intelligence. He's very good at logical thinking and mapping and planning things out. But he is not the most wise person in the world. He is not particularly wise intentionally, and that is kind of his dump stat. But also because that gets played out into stuff, and he does reckless things that he really shouldn't be doing. Like he will run out in the front line and start tanking hits and stuff. And it's like, now for a wizard, he's pretty tanky, but he's still a wizard. Uh, and it's like 2 rounds of combat. He's burned through all of his shield spells and
Yeah.
he's like at 10 HP, just like, I shouldn't have done that. I should not have done that.
Absolutely. I do like building a lot of my flaws into personality to be RP'd out. Um, in particular, my character for your campaign, one of my biggest flaws that I really thought about was tied to my charisma, which is my best stat for that character, and the element of being confident and then turning it into overconfidence and a lack of or a complete disregard of caution, which was seen very recently when I opened a box very uncaringly, uh, knowing that there was something going to happen as a player, and blowing up the party in the middle of the night, for the most part, uh, and getting the ire from them for doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Building that social aspect in of their eyes are very angry and looking at me, and I'm in trouble.
Yeah, and I have to share that with everybody because it was hilarious. And I loved you for it as the DM. I was like, thank you so much for doing that. That was beautiful. I had the party find a chest, like a large chest, inside of a large mimic cave. In that the cave was a mimic and it was trying to eat them, and but they found this. It wasn't like a large chest, but it was a little chest container. And there was a very obvious glyph of warding on there. And so they got it and they were like, do we know what that is? And they succeeded on some high enough checks that are like, you're pretty sure that's a glyph of warding, which could do a lot of different things, but in all probability, none of them are going to be pleasant for you if you touch it or somehow trigger it. And they're like, oh, well, let's mess with that later. And Brand's character was all like, I can, if we wait until the morning, I can deal with that and get rid of it. And they're like, oh, well, here you go. And so he goes to bed, and then he's just like, I just open it. I just open the chest.
Yeah,
And
I unlock it and I open it.
And I'm like, okay, I just go back. He sent me a message of that privately, and so then
Yeah.
I'm like, okay. So then I just interrupt everybody. I'm like, oh, by the way, everybody, when you're setting up camp, so in your positions in the camp, who's the farthest from Brand's character? Who is across the camp? And they're all like, I don't know what, I don't see what that. And I'm just like, no, just think of where you are. And then finally we're like, okay, the horses are here, blah, blah. We go through this whole setup, and someone's like, well, I want to be way away from the horses. So I'm nowhere near him. I'm like, okay, good. So you're on that side. All right. Everyone except him, roll a dexterity saving throw.
I blew people up. And
blew up pretty much the whole camp. I mean,
yeah,
one
and that's
character almost
building.
died.
Yeah, and that's building flaws into personality. And it's like, my character at this moment is not concerned about what's going to happen with opening this box, and is more curious about seeing what does happen with it. And then did so, and it nearly killed someone, and that is not a good thing for your group.
But
So
now
there are
maybe he has that
repercussions
to
to
think
that.
about.
Yeah,
Like, he almost killed one of the party members.
yeah. So that's going to affect my character going forward and how they interact with him, and so that's a flaw. That's a good flaw, I think, and that the other party can now interact with you in a new way when that flaw comes up.
Never giving him another box.
Exactly.
So, as I said, I really like social flaws, but I think it also depends perhaps on what for you the purpose of flaws is. And so that was my next and final question is, what is the purpose of having a weakness?
In the RP sense, when you're coming up with them, for me, it's about shareable moments. It's about things, either people laughing or people getting blown up. Something coming up that creates a new, even if only very temporary, situation that the party has to deal with, or you and one or two people in your party have to deal with.
For sure. That pretty much ties in with what I was going to say. I mean, on the one hand, it makes your character more realistic and more personable. Because people have flaws, people have weaknesses, and so having a character that's not perfect all the time, a character that has some real character flaws, some real personality traits that are not ideal, or also possibly some mechanical flaws, that are some things that might be physically wrong with them, or things they're just not really great at. It definitely makes them more personable. But I think really it's to build ties and relationships with other characters. Like, especially for me, I like to look at things, like I said, I like to look at flaws that relate to their goals in some fashion, or at least some of their flaws might impact their goals or their pursuit of their goals. I don't like taking things that aren't going to come into play. I want things that are going to impede them in some fashion. And one of the things that is a consequence of that is because it's impeding them, they're probably going to look to other people to supplement that. They're going to look to the other party members and go, okay, this is my partner in crime, or, this person, I can rely on them for this skill or this type of social interaction stuff that I'm not good at. And that may help to broach some different role play interactions and help build some relationships where there's a mutual benefit. You have some skills that they can benefit from, and they have some things that you can benefit from. And because if you're good at everything, you don't really, what do you need the other party members for? Just to soak up damage. It's important, I think, to view flaws as an opportunity to engage with other people, whether you're sharing a moment or you're muted, I think. You're still muted somehow. Nope, I can't hear that. This is the problem we were having with our meeting earlier. It was deciding to mute him for some reason. Please pardon our progress while we wait for the meeting software to allow Brand to speak. Can't hear you. As we're saying that, let's see. Look at chat real quick. Grimslag, weakness adds character. For sure. It definitely makes people more personable. It helps to make them more human, even if they're not human. But yeah, Bao. It's very useful to help players, besides just being focused on your quests and goals, but to create roleplay moments, to create moral dilemmas sometimes where you may want someone's help with something that they don't even want to help with, but you're their friend. So yeah, I would say I don't necessarily entirely disagree with that, Plague. If your party, I think that having party members cover for your flaws, and I'll say I kind of disagree with that, not completely. I think it's fair to have a flaw that your party members can help to compensate for, that they can, work, that you have to go to them and then go, hey, I'm not good at this, but I really want to do this thing. Can you come help me? Now, if it's just like the example I gave earlier, if it's the barbarian who's bad at social skills, so they just let the party always tend to that, in that case, I do agree. Like, that's not really a flaw because you're just standing in the background letting the party do all the talking. But if your character has goals and things they want to do that require them to be engaging in social interactions, but in order to succeed at that, they have to get help from the party because they're not necessarily good at everything they need to do, I think that's valid.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Unfortunately, I think my mic is no longer working, so I'm using my laptop webcam mic.
The bathroom. We're suddenly in a bathroom again.
Yep. Sorry.
Well, we're almost at the end there, so that's okay. Let's see what you had to say, because if you can remember.
I can. I was talking about the idea that the word flaw kind of comes off as negative, and it certainly doesn't have to be. Your flaws can be built into simple positive actions that just inherently cause something to go wrong every now and then, just by maybe you're too nice, and that could be a flaw. It's a positive outtake on something that could hurt you later. I made a character that was very nice previously, who had the habit of saying hello or hi constantly to authority figures, and that actually got him into trouble at one point when he really didn't need it.
Sneaking around invisible through the city and by habit say hi to the guard as you walk past.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, I very much would agree that that's still a flaw. It's something that is detrimental to you at some point. And I think that's the point. A flaw has to be detrimental. I don't think it necessarily always has to be detrimental. And I think it's okay if you can find ways to get help to
Yes.
compensate for those things. Because for me, that's kind of the point of a flaw. A flaw shouldn't necessarily cripple you as much as it makes you rely on other people, and it helps to provide interactions with those people. It helps to create those shared moments.
Exactly.
And sometimes that moment is just them laughing at you, and sometimes it's you having to go to them and ask for their help.
Haha. I think my mic is now working.
Just in time for me to wrap things up. Do you have any? Did you remember what you wanted to talk about earlier? Does anyone have any other questions or things you wanted to bring up in chat for us?
I did not remember my thing about values. So
Do you have
no.
any other things about this you wanted to bring up?
I mean, I like flaws, whether it's mechanical or inspired through personality, and it's just a nice way to try to think about your character in a more realistic manner. I think that really
Yeah.
brings the realism into your character if you're trying to RP is the flaws in particular.
Yeah, and I can agree with that. I think it's very important for people when creating characters to think about their flaws. Too often we really want to think about a character's strengths. We want to think about what's amazing and awesome about them, what's going to be really fun to play. But flaws can be really fun. They don't have to always be a massive drag. They can be enjoyable things to do because sometimes it is fun to fail.
Absolutely.
Or at the very least to have a challenge that comes up because of something you did and then to succeed and triumph over that in a different way.
Yeah.
Your character can't help but just steal stuff sometimes. They see something valuable and they want to grab it, and it lands them getting arrested, thrown into a prison, and now you have a new challenge. Your group has to break them out, or you all have to somehow escape from this situation. It creates dynamic content that's very fun. It can be very exciting.
Absolutely. And they can be built into your story as well as your group's story in moments of sharing with your group elements about your character through these flaws.
Absolutely. So that's pretty much our show for tonight. Thanks everybody for coming and hanging out. We will have another episode, not this coming Wednesday, but the next Wednesday. We do an episode every other Wednesday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Our next episode is going to be on giving life to your character through mannerisms and voice. It will be our final in a series of creating characters for D&D 5e. Though this, I guess, this one is a little bit more broad and could apply to way more.
Yeah, a little more generic.
But so could values and vulnerabilities. So, but we're going to be looking at it through that lens, through the Dungeons and Dragons lens and those settings and seeing, we'll see what we want to talk about then.
Yeah.
So thanks everybody and have a good night. And remember, if it's a headset, it's probably not a mimic.